So a little fun fact. I bring my lav mic every time I do a presentation, and that's because as much as I grew up in the States, I picked up a lot of Israeli mannerisms from my dad, and I still talk with my hands, and a mic just kind of gets in the way with that. But yeah, so I'm really excited to be here. I think like the first creative thing I did this morning was kind of find my own definition of flow and retrofitted a lecture to fit that. Today we're going to be talking about the flow of decision making within product teams. With a show of hands, how many people actually work in a tech company? Okay, so we have a few. For the ones that don't work within a tech company, don't worry. This goes into the behavioral psychology of how smart people make decisions at large. So it's applicable even outside of product teams. There might just be some jargon that's specific to the tech world, but most of it can be applied outside of it. So the name of the lecture is Why We Suck at Creating Products People Love, and the cognitive biases that get in our way of making better decisions. Today we're going to be talking about the flow of how teams make decisions and how they kind of shoot themselves in the foot in the process. So who I am, I'm Didi Medina. I'm a product designer by background. I grew up as a product designer. I'm actually only 26. I started my first company when I was about 15. It got offered to be acquired. I said no, and then it failed. Moved to Silicon Valley when I was like about 17 for my first product design job. Worked there for about 6 years with amazing companies such as eBay, Amazon, Square Cash, Teespring, and a couple of other ones that are here. I lived there for a bit, didn't like the area. It wasn't for me. I wasn't fitting in culturally. Came back to New York for about 2 years where I ran management for Compass on 2 teams. So at that point I was doing product management. I was the youngest in that company. It was a Fortune 1000 company. I was 21 and everybody on my level was 35. It was very weird, and it's usually the case. Try to make it work. And then I moved to Israel 2 years ago. I live in Jerusalem. I live right on the Gripas, right next to Shuk Machane Yehuda. And in today's day, I don't do much product design. What I do is design ops. And what that means is I'm responsible for going into companies and helping them kind of get their shit in order so that designers can have an easier time doing their job. And that's usually relevant once you have like multiple people on a team. You have to think about, hey, how do we interview people? What's the protocol for that? What meetings do we have? Which ones do we don't? How do we hire? How do we fire? All the things around design that makes a product team significantly more efficient. So that's operations. If I do a good job, designers like to do their job more, because as you grow, it becomes significantly more painful. So a little bit of a heads up, I curse. I'm not really sorry about this. It's just like part of me growing up in New York. I'm sorry that I never did anything to change it. It's just part of who I am. So giving you all a heads up, I realize there's a little baby in the crowd. You want earmuffs, I got you, but otherwise, let's continue. So we're going to start off this lecture with a basic principle where I want to bring precedence to the fact that within a product team, we are all creators. And what that means is naturally, we think about solving, we think about building, but our job or a natural state of mind is not around understanding and empathizing, right? And this is true for engineers, designers, marketers, everybody who deems themselves as a creator. You're all part of that process. And no more hand gestures. Okay. So building mode, if you think about creators from that vantage point, you can see how like creators feel most comfortable in building mode. And what building mode means is like for an engineer, it's with VS Code, which is like their programming software. Or with a designer, it's having Photoshop or Sketch or Figma open. They're pretty much running to get into this environment as fast as possible, and they'll, whether they admit it or not, try to cut corners up until that point, right? Which undermines the steps before. However, every product person has to accept the fact that a problem has to come first. A problem has to exist. A problem always exists first, and I'll give a couple of examples. Some people are of the opinion that, no, people don't, there's not always a problem. Sometimes you have to create something that people don't know is valuable yet. And to that, we'll go into a second example where we're going to talk about failure due to bad timing, right? So what is it? Let's go with the example that most people like to float around. Most product people know this one, and they use it as an excuse, which is the faster horse. They talk about Henry Ford and the story where Henry Ford said, or notoriously said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. right? This doesn't mean necessarily that there's no problem that exists. This doesn't justify your ability to say, I'm an authoritative figure and I know what's best, so that means I don't have to go out of my way to try to understand the landscape. What this means is if you talk to people, they might not have an idea of what a good solution might be, but they very much know their problem. Exhibit A, B, and C. Right? Owning a horse comes with the problem of cleaning shit every single day, feeding a hay daily, and also you can't live in the city. You have to live on a farm. So, and if you look at history, you'll also see how horses, cars, started selling directly correlated to the development of metropolitan areas. There's a direct correlation to those two graphs. Now, let's talk about the reading glasses. Which is also an interesting story, also a very valuable thing. But it actually came out 80 years before it was massively used. And the tipping point was actually the printing press. Before the printing press came out, the reading glasses were out, but it was just bad timing. It was before its time. Maybe some people needed it, people in very high class that had maybe the only book or Bible that was around at the time. But once the printing press was out and more people started reading, you started having some need to sell glasses or reading glasses at a certain scale. So it's very much possible to fail due to bad timing. This applies to a lot of different markets that are in very revolutionary markets. You have to accept that either you're not going to win in the short term, like for example, Magic Leap, which is a company that does a lot of AR and VR, they're funded for the next 20 years. They have like $4 billion in funding. They haven't even pushed anything out to market because they know they're before its time and they need a lot of time to develop this technology. But other companies, they go into it saying, hey, if I put together $500,000 in funding, I will be able to create something that's pretty cool and everybody's going to want to use it tomorrow. That's not necessarily true. Holding yourself accountable to this is really important. So another principle I like to teach companies that I work with and consult is the fact that a business, at the end of the day, is a market servant. And what that means is a market is simply a group of people that share a common problem. And some people might argue, is the group big? Is it small? It doesn't necessarily matter too much. What matters on there's other conditions. Say, for example, you're creating a product that's for governments and you can sell it for $20 million a year and you sell it to 3 governments. Well, you have a very viable business. On other hands, like if you create a product that sells for $1 and you need millions of people to buy it in order to stay viable, meaning just to pay out your salaries for the company, then you need significantly more. So the group size is relative. But at the end of the day, you need to evaluate, hey, how many people have this problem? Even if it's one and you're building a whole company to be an agency to one company as a problem, that's fine as long as it makes economical sense. But at the end of the day, a market is simply a group of people that share a common problem at a given point in time in history. Failing to understand this problem will result in intuitionism infesting your overall organization. So this is where we're going to start getting into the behavioral psychology of this stuff. And I guess we can start off with the very obvious thing that's hitting your minds right now, which is, what the fuck is intuitionism? Okay, so intuitionism, according to Jonathan Haidt, who's a brilliant psychologist who studies moral psychology. He wrote the book, The Righteous Mind, which tries to understand why do people believe they're right even when they're wrong. He studies this from the angles of religion and politics, which are very, very, very extreme topics. A brilliant, brilliant book. I really highly recommend it, even if you're not trying to learn about politics or religion, but necessarily just more how people make decisions. He says intuitionism is a natural inclination to use intuition to decide between right and wrong, and then after that, create arguments to justify your intuition after the fact. So Daniel Kahneman, which is probably a person you guys are more familiar with. He won a Nobel Prize in behavioral economics. He studied at the Hebrew U. He's one of ours. He has a way of breaking down the brain into 2 systems that both partake in decision making, which is system 1 and system 2. System 1 is fight or flight. System 2 is like the deep thinking, trying to understand the details before coming to a decision. And as we evolved as humans, we came to use system 1 more and more. And this should be obvious because if you stop to assess every little thing you're about to decide on, you can understand how you wouldn't just get on with your day, right? If you're trying to do like a million lines of computation every time you go to Starbucks and they're like, what coffee do you want? You wouldn't get to 12 p.m. with any food in your stomach, you'll die, right? So we, over time, evolved to use system one more and more and more and more. And as that happened, naturally, you can understand how things that deserve more thought, just out of force of habit, fell into being processed through system one instead of system two. Coming back to Jonathan Haidt, he gives another analogy that kind of represents system one and system two, which is the elephant and the rider. It's pretty much to say that your intuition is the elephant and your rational thinking or your deep reasoning, your strategic reasoning is the rider. Whereas the elephant does most of like the directing and the rider kind of adjusts course. And the elephant is really pivotal because it's not to be mistaken for a horse or something that's more nimble. It very much is this big behemoth that's hard to maneuver. As humans, and I think like this pegs the question of like why do we behave this way? And this comes back to the most primitive psychological mechanism that we have, which is as humans, we care more about seeming right in the moment than we are about getting closer to the truth. And the reason for that is being a contrarian, being someone who's capable of challenging what the group thinks is right, naturally puts you in a situation where you're outside of the group, which challenges your ability to feel like you have a sense of belonging, which is one of your like deepest survival instincts. So most people are not going to go out of their way to be a contrarian, even if it's a means to find some really innovative or really interesting resolves, because in the end of the day, that's very emotionally taxing for 99.9% of us. Ironically, this is something that Jonathan Haidt observed, is the smarter you are, the more susceptible you are to this cognitive bias. Because when you talk to people that are very smart, they tend to say the very obvious thing, which is like, oh, I get all this. This is really, really interesting. But it wouldn't apply to me. I'm smarter than that, right? And the truth is actually the smarter you are, the higher IQ you have, you're more likely to exert this behavior. And the reason for that is because in the end of the day, you end up, the way intuition works is you first decide with intuition, and if you're really smart, you're more capable of coming up with arguments that are more clever to justify your intuition. And to make this point, I can just like simply like portray a story. Like everybody in this room probably has a friend that has at one point in their life broken up with a partner and then decided to get back with them, right? Everybody has a friend like that? Okay. And if you were there for both conversations, it's phenomenal to witness. It's like when they first break up, they're like, listen, man, it's been 5 years, I know, but after further thought, there's this, there's that, and all these different things, and everything sounds like on point. This guy gave it like a lot of thought, and he's just like set that it's like just not for him, and he might go through some emotional burden getting over it, but it's all about moving forwards, onwards and upwards, everything that, you can get out of a Tim Ferriss or Tony Robbins book, and then you're on with your life. And then long and behold, 3 months later, he comes back. He's like, oh, did you know I got back together with my partner? And you're like, oh, why? You just said 3 months ago all this extra stuff. And then he makes like a much, much more extravagant story that first like kind of counters all of the points he first made and kind of extends more information that wasn't brought to light beforehand. And now all of a sudden it's completely justifiable that they're back together. This is the way we work. The smarter you are, actually, the more capable you are of doing things like this. It doesn't only apply in relationships, it also applies with the things you work on. So how does this affect the ability to create products people love? I think twofold, right? Like first and foremost, we're not the user, we're the customer. Right? Sorry, we're not the user or the customer, we're the creators. Right? And the customer is very different than us. So our intuition doesn't necessarily always serve them. So if we use our intuition to make decisions on their behalf, we'd likely be wrong. And how does the fact that we're smarter affect us? Is all throughout the journey of creating stuff on their behalf, we'd probably come up with stories to justify how our reasoning, though is based on intuition, is actually based on complete rational thinking that's super, super supportive of what the customer needs, because it's not that hard to draft a story as to how, even though I'm not a mom that lives in Utah that's trying to manage her finances, me as an ignorant designer in San Francisco can completely understand why it is and what problems she actually has to solve for that, right? So we're pretty convinced ourselves in that manner. So it can hijack the entire process. And in summary, basically assume we're always biased, and if we're super smart, we're super biased. So how do you mitigate the damage of intuitionism within any given process, organization, or creating anything, whether it's product or anything else that you're working on? So there's this thing I call problem statements. So problem statements is a simple exercise where you write down like the problem and a couple other parameters. It's not necessarily a PRD, which some of you, if you're in the tech world, probably know, which stands for product requirement document. It's not supposed to specify what the product does or how it's going to be used or all this different stuff. It's simply an intuition checker. It's supposed to highlight the problem. It's supposed to highlight what the why is, like why you believe things to be true on a very, very high level. And for me, I think in product design, a lot of things start and also end with how you can write it down on paper. And as a principle, I genuinely believe that if you can't write it down on paper, you don't understand it well enough. And this applies for everything. I find myself, when I write something down, all of a sudden I'm able to see like a more abstract picture and connect more dots or find things that were inconsistent with my original thinking. So the questions that I like to ask in this exercise are 3 questions. It's actually quite simple to do. I highly recommend people do it blindly within organizations, meaning you give your coworkers the same 3 questions and see what they answer, and you'll see how unaligned you are. So first you start off with what is the problem we're trying to solve. This one sounds like an obvious one, but you'd be surprised how many people ask this question and they answer it wrong because they answer with a solution. What is the problem you're trying to solve? Oh, we're trying to create this for the world because it's going to make it a better place. That's a solution. Right? It's not a problem. What's the problem? So if we had to use an example for this entire presentation, let's use creating a recipe app. Right? If someone came to me and said, oh, I want to make logging your recipe significantly easier, that's a solution, that's not a problem. There's also ways to write down the problem and write it really in a really shitty way, which is the fact that you're not highlighting circumstance, you're not highlighting who it applies to, who it doesn't apply to. So let's give an example. I'll give an example of a really bad problem statement. Say, for example, a really bad one is all the apps on the App Store that are for recipes have bad reviews, so people don't like it. Like that's a terrible problem. It's not clear. It doesn't. If you think about it, noodle on it, you're not ready to take action. You don't know where to start. So that's where you can use that gut to measure whether or not you've been specific enough. A good problem statement is to say, hobbyist chefs at home who need to jot down some notes have a hard time capturing their ideas somewhere they can bring it back up in the future because all the existing apps are very constraining from the angle of they require too much information and too much structure. And for someone who's just a hobbyist, they just need to jot down the things they tend to forget, not the entire recipe. That's an interesting problem. Like you start to get like scope, you start to get an understanding of what's part of this project and what's not, who it's for, all these different things. Obviously, like I rambled a little bit, you can clean up the words and make it a little more concise, but you got the right pillars. The next question is, how do we know this problem needs solving? And most people answer this from their standpoint. As a business, if we solve this problem, become millionaires, right? That's not a reason, right? A business makes benefits via proxy of benefiting other people. It's almost like altruistic in nature, right? If you don't benefit others, you don't make money. And if you don't make money, then you're not a business. So your concern is to first start with the people who are going to pay you, your buyers, your customers, whatever it may mean, right? If you benefit 100,000 people, the collective consolidated amount that they each contribute, a portion of that goes into your pocket, right? And that's how you become really, really rich. So you start with them. And pretty much here, if we go on the same use case, you can say that the reason why I know that hobbyist chefs need a different app is because after talking to, say, 15 hobbyist chefs, friends, families, whatever, they all told me that they write their recipes on pen and paper. Right, that's an interesting validator of the problem that I specified. And I asked them, have you tried out different recipe apps? And if they said yes, and yet they still write on pen and paper, that all the more validates my problem statement initially, right? And you can create a couple of bullet points as to the things that can further validate it. You can look at on the macro level, you can look at the micro level, you can talk to 15 people, you can look at trends in the market. I would recommend doing a balance of both. The last question is, how do we know we've successfully solved the problem we set out to solve? And most people answer this also very vaguely. They would just say like, oh, see 100,000 signups. That's not the problem you set out to solve. It's not the sign-up thing. It's a thing for hobbyist chefs. How do you know they are going to actually benefit from this? How would you be able to measure that you actually solved the problem? Not that you're successful as a company. They're two different questions. It's how do you know you solved the problem? And the answer to this would be somewhere along the lines of, after we finish our building the app, we'll put it in the hands of hobbyist chefs and see how many of them feel comfortable switching from paper and pen over to this app as an alternative. That would be a successful measure because it matches what it is you were saying the whole way through, right? So you can see how, like, as you answer these questions, you start setting scope. It starts setting guardrails of what you can and cannot do, or what you will and will not work on, which helps the team focus. Now, a lot of companies come to me and say, hey, like, what if we don't have time to do this? People don't want to invest in this. They just like forcive and they just want to continue in their ignorant ways. To that, I would just say, do something smaller, which is monitor your day-to-day dialogue, and I can give you a framework for that. PPSS is what I call it, which is people, problem, story, solution. So a lot of times when you come into a conversation with a colleague, you just start off with the brainstorming. Right? Well, let's come up with ideas. And this is really, really toxic because you have to kind of start off by resetting what is the problem, talk about it for even 5-10 minutes. Hell, if you have an hour conversation, 30 minutes is about resetting, and then after that it's brainstorming. You'll have significantly higher quality output than had you just start with the actual ideation. Okay, so the progression is usually people. Start off by talking about your customers, the people you're doing this for. Try to empathize with them, talk about their situation, talk about it in a really real way. Don't just say, John Doe needs this. Talk about his life, almost explain him, right? Then talk about his problems. That's going to be a very natural progression. And then a story, which is similar to, like, if you guys are familiar with Scrum or the process. In essence, it's a summary of the people and the problems. You say, John Doe, this customer wants to achieve this so that he can do Y, right? Like, what is the purpose? You're just pretty much summarizing the person, who it is, the problem they have, and why it's important to them into one sentence. That's the story. And then once you're done with that, you start by saying, all right, fine, how can we solve this? Now, if you do this in conversation, you'll have significantly better ideas. It's easy to do. It's not really hard. You can push people into the structure. I know all of us have been in meetings that are really, really shitty. I know people like to say meetings are crap and meetings are hell, but it's not true. Meetings are necessary, but at the end of the day, the reason why we hate them is because they're poorly run. So if you can run a meeting more effectively and people feel more clear-headed when they leave it, trust me, they'll sign up to come to more of your meetings, and they'll also contribute to your overall initiative and your success significantly more. The last thing is, I did this over at Compass, which was kind of like a buddy system. Talking on behalf of your customers requires you to have a relationship with your customers. And I'm not talking about one where you like answer their emails or do customer support tickets. Like, actually befriend one of your customers that's actively using your product. So at Compass, we created tools for real estate agents that worked within our brokerage. So what I did was I ran a program where I paired up every single designer and engineer with a real estate agent, and they would have to get coffee once a week just to talk the shits. They just have to like catch up on life and hang out, and most of these people actually ended up being friends way after. My best friend right now is the person I have like from that program. His name's Richard Rojas, and he's still a really, really close friend. And part of this process is really finding people that the other person on the receiving end can relate with. So it shouldn't come off dry. So there's different personalities, match them up properly. Eventually they can become friends and they'll represent them in their arguments. And when you come into a meeting, I can actually say, hey, Richard wouldn't like this for A, B, C, and D reason. And when somebody else would say, but Emmanuel would because he's on this kind of team and he would need this, this, and this, it's actually a much more authentic conversation that yields significantly better results. So that's another thing as far as like a creative idea as to how you can implement it. But all in all, empathy always comes first, and you're not as smart as you think you are, and you being smart, even if you're convinced you're smart, will get in your way. So try to keep that in mind, and hopefully we'll continue to make better products that people love. Thank you.